Now, Mr. Boudro is familiar to us since he spoke to us yesterday, so I'm just going to allow him to get right into it so we have enough time for questions and perhaps a giveaway or two at the end. So he will now be speaking on how to support your business partners through effective consulting. Please welcome Mr. Jeff Boudro.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. A nice, warm Jamaica welcome. Thank you. I'm excited to talk to you about this topic, and I think you, if you went through the presentation with me yesterday afternoon, by the way, thank you for doing that at the end of the day, you'll find that there's some similarities in this from yesterday. And that's largely because our company, Power and Systems, what we do is we help individuals and organizations increase the amount of power and influence they have in the organization, hence the word power. And systems really refers to the fact that we really take a systemic look at organizations and do deep dives into the dynamics that get created over and over again in organizations like we experienced yesterday with being in the middle. In fact, some of you might be thinking, I'm not really a consultant, but I'd like to hear more about this presentation. By the end of this presentation, I'm hoping that you all see yourselves as consultants, if you don't already. Because in many ways, if you are in the middle in your organization, you are many times wearing a consultant hat. So we want to explore that together. So, what we're going to do today is really take a look specifically at what we refer to as the space of service. When you're in the middle, oftentimes you are of service to other people, that you're helping them get done what they need to accomplish in the organization. And we're going to do that by taking a very practical approach to consulting work. And consulting will actually define that at 5 different levels. And you'll determine for yourself 2 things. What level do you think you're operating at today? And for the future, what level do you want to be operating at or should be operating at? And we'll really be focusing on how do we shift our perspective. We're not going to talk about the 10 steps to consulting. We're going to really look at a very predictable condition that exists in the consulting space, much like we did yesterday with the middle space. And what we'll be doing is focusing largely on the relationship side. We won't be concerning ourselves so much, although it might come up in your examples or in your questions on the technical side, but largely we'll really be achieving one objective and thinking about when we are in an advisory capacity with our clients, whether they be internal or external, we are really in a consultant role. So what do we mean by consultant? Well, as I mentioned, there are at least 5 different levels that we'll look at today. You might even bring other gradients into the equation. And I'm going to ask you again to consider the 2 questions I just mentioned a minute ago. Which level are you operating on right now? And not where you should be, but where are you actually spending the majority of your time when you're, again, in an advisory capacity with your clients? And just as importantly, perhaps more importantly, where do you want to be in the future, depending on how you can fully fill out your role and maximize your performance, or if you aspire to a different type of role or a different level role in your organization. So let's define this a little bit. Administrator, and by the way, it kind of goes from at the top, less contact with your client, all the way down to the bottom, which is daily, frequent, and deep contact with your client. So with an administrator, you might be in an administrator consulting role, and that might mean you're planning information and resources. It might be schedules, it might be contracts, it might be resources that you're bringing to bear, and you're really supporting that client relationship in that sort of way. So as an administrator, you might not have that much contact with the client, but you play a very important supportive role in terms of helping them accomplish what they need to accomplish. A technical expert is another level of consultant. Just to define our terms there, what we mean by that is someone that has a great deal of technical expertise that's needed for a given project or initiative, and you are making sure that either through your project knowledge or your technical knowledge, again, you're supporting the effort of that overall initiative and that client. A trainer, much like I'm acting in this capacity today, a trainer is the person that perhaps is conveying lots of information to groups, whether it be small groups or large groups like this. And again, it might be training people on specific skills or it might be helping them understand the rollout of a major change transformation project in the organization, or a particular project, something of that nature. A problem-solving facilitator is what most people traditionally think of as a consultant, and that's someone who is working directly with clients to ID the problems, diagnose them, and work on solutions, more often of an individual nature. So there's obviously a lot more client contact in that level of consulting. And then last but not least, we have the change agent, who's working not only directly with the client on a daily basis, but working on deep strategic issues and working across the organization on organizational transformation initiatives. So I want you to pause for a second now that you have those definitions in mind and think about, where are you most often? You might find yourself in more than one of these places, but where are you most often? And then again, I want you to also think about, where do you want to be in the future? Whether that's really, again, filling out your current role more fully, or whether it's aspiring to a next promotion or a next role for yourself. Before I move forward, any questions on what I mean by these 5 levels as we get into this? Clear so far? A nod would be helpful, or a heck yeah, or something like that. All right. Great. Well, what we're going to look at, as I mentioned, we're not going to go through an exhaustive list of the 10 steps to be an effective consultant. You can get that in lots of books. In fact, I have some to recommend at the end of this presentation. But we are going to look at the very systemic nature of what it means to be a consultant, and some of the traps and pitfalls that can occur, as well as some of the opportunities that you can really leverage and take advantage of. So one of the things that we're going to look at is what we refer to as an effective consulting model that starts with, what are the predictable conditions that happen when you engage in consulting? In fact, in many ways, this presentation is actually about the first 60 seconds of your consulting engagement with a client, a new client or an existing one for a return engagement. Those first 60 seconds, we have found through our research, are actually critical to the entire life cycle of the project or the initiative that you're working on with your client. And what typically happens, and I talked yesterday about the predictable condition of being in the middle, is that tearing space. It's a different predictable condition when we look at a smaller part of the middle space, which is the space of service or of consulting. And what we find is that the predictable condition is one of ignorance and multiple expectations. Let me explain what I mean by that, because we're not talking about the intelligence of the people involved at all. It's not a matter of that. It's actually a matter of ignorance of everything that's going on in the situation, and nobody could possibly understand all that's going on behind the scenes whenever you're trying to solve an organizational issue, whether it be small, medium, or large. However, as human beings, we have a very natural reflex action that causes us to act as if this condition didn't exist. And I'll explain that in a second. By multiple expectations, what I mean by that is there's multiple expectations for you, the consultant. There's certainly multiple expectations for the client or clients that you're serving. And there's expectations of all the stakeholders involved, whether it be the organization or all the people who will be affected by whatever it is you're working on. And one of the things that we find in this predictable condition is that there's, as usual, a very common reflex action. And this is where it gets dangerous. And again, this typically occurs in the first 60 seconds. The predictable response, not always, not every person, but with great regularity, is to try to be of immediate value. Being of immediate value either in one direction or the other, typically, is what we see. Either showing up as the expert, saying, I got this, I've seen this before, I know exactly what to do, trust me, we'll see this through, it'll be completely successful. So it's really tempting to jump up as the expert, because after all, that's why you've been called to the table. That's why you're there. That's why your company has asked you to come in and work on this project, or that's why another company has hired you to come in to tell them what to do and get to successful completion. I'll come back to that in 1 second. The other reflex action that is kind of the opposite of that, but still same reflex action, is to show up as a servant. What do you need me to do? I'm here, I'll work 60 hours a week, 80 hours a week, whatever it takes, I will get this job done. Just tell me what to do, set me loose, and I'll go do it. These are two very common reactions that when we're faced with someone coming to us and saying, we need your help, or we're hiring you for your help on this project. Just by hands, have you ever felt the pull of either the expert or the servant when you've been asked to help on a project as a consultant? How many people, can I just see hands? So at least half of the room has recognized this and felt this before. Well, we'll try to make it a little bit more real. In fact, I'll give you a couple of examples. One example for me as an expert, since I've worked in this field for several decades, is that when I get called in to do a large-scale training initiative, maybe a rollout across a whole company, it's very easy for me to say, all right, give me a few data points. All right, I know exactly what to do, and I can show up and say, all right, we should do X, Y, and Z. Here's our approach. Here's the approximate timeline. Here's the resources that we'll need. And I have lots of facts and figures and experience to back me up. But when I allow myself to fall into that trap, I inevitably regret it later. Because inevitably, there's questions I didn't ask, there's data I didn't know, there's key stakeholders I didn't think to reach out to or to influence, and it comes back to bite me every time. So being the expert, even when you are the expert, is very dangerous, number one. Number two, I can give you an example of where I showed up as the servant. And even though that wouldn't naturally be my style, there are times when it feels like the natural reaction for the situation at hand. I remember very distinctly walking into the situation where I was hired by an outside client. They wanted me to do some team building training, which sometimes is actually a cover story for what's really going on. They say we need team building. Our team's really not functioning that well together. And when I met with this leader, very strong personality and very clear on what he wanted. And so he said, here's what we want, here's what it's going to look like, here's the things we have to cover, here are the desired outcomes. And I was impressed. They had a very clear picture. Most times it's like, please help me. A lot of clients don't know what they want. This client knew exactly what they wanted. Unfortunately, I didn't question enough, and I showed up in the role of servant. All right, we can do that. Here's what it's going to cost. Here's the resources I'll need. And I answered their questions, and I got to work delivering what they had asked me to deliver. What I didn't realize until much later is that the team building issue that they had was at least in fair measure due to his leadership style. He was a big component of what was going on in that system, in that dynamic, and because I showed up as a servant, dutifully doing what I was told needed to be done, I didn't get that until halfway through the engagement. And then I had the unenviable task of going back and renegotiating what it was that needed to be delivered for this client to really meet their needs. So in both cases, the work got done, don't get me wrong, but a lot of problems and a lot of issues that were avoidable, unfortunately, I slipped right into them. So the first 60 seconds, I know that might sound hard to believe, really sets the tone and the trajectory of your entire engagement with that client. And it's not like you can't come back and rework it, because anytime you're working on a complex issue, you're going to find data halfway through. You're going to have to readjust and re-strategize, but it can save you a whole lot of pain and a whole lot of extra wasted resources if you do it up front versus halfway through or midstream. So, before I go any further, just want to check on this. Does expert and servant make sense to you? Do you understand? Any questions about what I'm saying in terms of those two responses? I'm seeing nodding heads. Good, good. All right. Because it's important that you understand this, because you know me already. You're going to be doing it pretty soon. So what happens after this is that if you get sucked into that automatic reflex action, again, not every time, but with great regularity, you will find yourself in a very familiar, disempowering scenario. I just described a couple of them. But what happens basically is that if you fall into that pitfall, if you go with that easy, you don't even have to think about it. It doesn't even feel like a choice. It's just like, I was hired to be an expert, I'm going to show up as an expert. I was hired for my skills, I'm going to show up as a servant. And it unfortunately turns into a situation which you might end up feeling abused and misused. In fact, you talk to any consultant that comes out of an Ivy League school or some top management consulting program and goes to work for one of the big four consulting firms, they're put to work immediately. 80 hours a week is kind of the standard expectation, and that comes with the territory. They know that they're going to kind of get beat up, and it kind of shakes out who's going to make it in the long run and who doesn't. But that's not necessarily what we all want to sign up for. That we don't want to end up in a situation where we end up feeling abused or misused. Let me give you a little bit more example of what I'm talking about. So when I showed up as an expert, or when any of us show up as an expert and get sucked into that trap, the abused and misused might look like this. Because you've said, all right, I understand what needs to be done. I know exactly what we need to do. And what you've just signed up for, whether you realize it or not, is if any changes happen, and they inevitably do, whether it's changes in budget or whether suddenly that leader who sponsored this isn't very available to answer your questions, or if there's organizational resistance, you've not only taken on that project, you've also taken on responsibility for addressing all these other issues. And you're going to feel the burden of that because you've shown up as the expert. Conversely, if you show up as the servant, that also can end up you feeling abused and misused, because you've signed up to say, all right, I'm here to execute what you've already decided to do, and I'm on board, and I will agree to deliver this, and I will meet your deadlines, and I will, hit all the deliverables. And then what happens? Changes happen, budgets get cut, et cetera, and now you're still on the hook for delivering because you said you would execute, but the conditions have changed, and suddenly you're in a very difficult situation, hard to deliver what you've now promised to deliver. So in either of these two cases, I want to make sure it's really clear that if you sign up for servant or expert, it can really lead to a hard road. And my number one goal today is to save you from that. And you'll be saving yourselves, actually, from that. But to illustrate this, we're going to get into some examples. Where does it go after that, though? Because after that familiar disempowering scenario, there is a way out. There is a way out, and that way out is to make sure that you're actually using effective consulting actions. And the single one lever that you have that is most powerful is a seemingly simple phrase. I'm going to try to use the laser without blowing up the screen. This right here that says, say no to being of immediate value. That is the key that I want to share with you today, and that's what we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about. What does that mean? And more importantly, how do you do that effectively? Because saying no to a client runs counter to what most of us think good client service is, what it means to be an effective consultant. But I want to be clear, we're not saying that you say no to the client, we're saying you're saying no to being of immediate value. Because that's the trap that we're really going to focus on today. That very often, what you experience when you get into that first contracting agreement is they tell you the problem, and our huge human brains that are computer-like doesn't like an unsolved problem. So immediately, before we even realize it, our brain is already at work saying, what's the solution, what's the solution? And there's a general discomfort among most of us with silence or having no answer. And again, if we're showing up as a servant or as an expert, our immediate gut level reaction is, I got to fill that void. I'm uncomfortable with that unresolved issue. And it's very seductive and it's very powerful, and sometimes we don't even notice it. We're blind to the choice we're making, but nonetheless, we get sucked into saying, yes, I've got the answers, or yes, I'll do what you're asking me to do, either one. So let's talk a little bit about what does that look like. What does saying no to being of immediate value look like? And the part that goes with that is, how do you develop a co-learning partnership with your customer so that the ignorance about the system, about what's really going on, big picture, disappears? Ignorance for you because you just don't know everything, and ignorance for the customer. In fact, both of you might think you know, but how can you assure yourselves that you're on solid ground before you go any further? So that's the model. I laid that out very quickly so we can get to work. Before I do, again, one last opportunity. What questions, if any, do you have about this model and what I'm explaining in terms of that first 60 seconds and the tendency for us as human beings to show up as either the expert or the servant to fill that void? Any questions or reactions to that? Please. Do you want the mic? You can use one of the mics if you want. Oh, here we go. If you could just say your name and where you're from.
Hello? Yes, that's more like it.
Your name and where you're from.
All right, I'm Martin Bennett, and I work with Jamaica Defense Force.
Great, thanks.
Yes. I love that part about not being of immediate value,
It's scary though, isn't it?
but it's very scary,
Tell me more about that.
right? One of the reasons, and you mention it very clearly, is that oftentimes we are going to come across as the experts. In the field that I work with, you should be the expert, right? So the idea of the client is that you are the expert, not necessarily I'll do what you want me to, but this is what I want, but you're the expert in how to get it across, not that I'm going to help you. Now, I'm
I like
in
where
a
you're
position,
going already.
Yes, I'm in a position where everybody say, if I don't accept it, everybody say, you are the expert. What should I do? You ask a question, and now I need an answer. The void, because you're in a very competitive field, right? The void in terms of being silent, right, is how do I, being the expert, there is a void, and keep that control in not being driven to go and feel it right now.
Yes.
What is, and at the same time, don't make it be evident. How do I do that?
You want some real ninja skills here, don't
yes,
you?
Yes, yeah. How do I do that?
Great. I owe you money because you couldn't have asked a better question. He's a plant in the audience, in case you didn't know that. No, not really. The question is a great one and really timely. Thank you for bringing that up. Because, yes, it's true, we do need to be experts. That's what we're hired for. And I want to draw a very clear distinction between and kind of reframe what being an expert means. I would actually suggest that being an expert doesn't mean that you have an immediate answer within 60 seconds of your consulting discussion. What are we going to do? Well, in order for me to answer that, we need to really understand what's going on here first. And let's talk about how we're going to get clear on what's going on and what the best solution is. Now, would I recommend that you say, well, we're going to need about a month to get back to you on that? No, I wouldn't, because there's not going to be a tolerance for that. But there's a big difference between saying, I need a month to answer your question, and I give you an answer right now within the first 60 seconds. And I am aware, as I say this, that when you're sitting there in front of a client or clients, and they're asking you for an answer and your expert opinion, every second feels like an hour. That's what it gets to be in our head. That's much more grandiose than it actually is. Every second that ticks by feels like an eternity. And what I'm telling you is the pull of being an expert or a servant and providing immediate value is very strong. And if you don't recognize that for what it is, then your ability to escape that gravitational pull is not good. But being aware of it is the first step. And number two, knowing yourself when you get into these situations that this is likely to happen will help you be prepared to deal with it better. And that's exactly what we're going to explore today. So I'm actually not going to give you an immediate answer, because that would be ironic, wouldn't it? But we are going to get to it, I promise you, and we're going to have a chance to play with this a little bit. But before we even get to the answer, we're going to experience, I want you to experience that gravitational pull a little bit. So I promise I will get back to you. One of the things that we see is that when you do engage them in this saying no to be immediate value and get them into a co-learning partnership, that you really reduce the ignorance of the conditions. So actually, not only is this a way to address and avoid being abused and misused, but part of the answer to your question is it actually starts to dissipate the ignorance by taking a well-timed approach to finding out more about the situation. Even if you think you already know, the simple exploration of asking the questions and engaging the client and not letting them think that either you're going to do their bidding or you're going to save the day as the expert and the hero, but that we're in this together, that's what you're really setting up as the dynamic. And that's really, big picture, what allows you to say no to being of immediate value, but at the same time replacing with that with something even more valuable and something even more powerful. Does that make sense at a top level? You can ask another question if you want. Grab the mic again. But we're going to get into the specifics, but that's the big picture. Go ahead.
Okay. So are you saying then, for me, for clarity,
Yes.
the way to fill that void is to actually recruit the person as being a part of the solution?
Yes, they are co-owner of
Yes.
this. And they already have a lot of skin in the game
Okay.
already.
Okay. All right. That's
And how you do that is very important. But go ahead with your question.
So how you do it is the question now.
Exactly.
And I guess it's about asking questions whereby the person now feel a responsibility to answer. And within answering these questions, you get the opportunity to think. Am I?
Yes, yeah, well, I think there's elements of truth to what you're saying. There's a couple things that I would adjust. So one thing I would say is that, yes, asking questions you'll find is a big part of this. So your instincts are right on target there. You almost have to, however, contract up front a little bit to say, well, I could give you my immediate answer, but it wouldn't be probably the answer we need. And what we need to do is actually join forces here to make sure that before we build a plan and I give you a solution, that we're actually on solid ground, because we don't want to make a plan that's based on faulty or incomplete information, do we?
What about an emergency situation?
Emergency situation might be different, and we can talk about that specifically as well. Thanks for both of those questions. So part of what we're going to get into, and you'll see this, so you're very clever at getting me to tell you things in advance of when I want to tell you them, because I'm a people pleaser and I don't want to leave questions unanswered. But what we'll find is, as you get into this, yes, there's something to do with the questions, there's something to do with contracting, that we want to approach this dynamic differently than me just giving you the answers or me just doing what you ask. And I can give you examples of things that I have said or things that I would recommend you say, but I want to be very cautious in saying, I don't want you to parrot what I say or what works for me, because your personality is perhaps different than mine, your style is different than mine, your relationships in the context of your consulting gigs are different than mine. So I'll give you examples, but ultimately, what today is about is you figuring out what's your path to renegotiating the beginning of this relationship. And when it comes to emergencies, I'm gonna put that partially in the parking lot and deal with that later. But for emergencies, I just want to acknowledge up front that if something is a crisis, then yes, you might have to show up and do what you can, because there's not time to really strategize or dig deeper. Although even in crises, the human nature is such that we hate unsolved problems and we want to jump to action. There's that powerful adrenaline surge in us that makes us want to jump to action. And I want to share with you one of my favorite quotes, and this usually is applied to innovation, but it really applies to your question here. And that is, Albert Einstein once said, if I had 20 days to solve a problem, I would spend the first 19 defining what the problem is. Because if you jump to immediate action and you're solving the wrong problem, you're not really helping in that emergency. So the second thing I would say, again at a high level, and we'll get back to this again later on emergencies, is that even if you have no choice in the moment, either because you had a moment of weakness, or because the person was so strong-willed that they wouldn't accept anything else but an immediate answer, or it's a true crisis and you had to react right away, I would say I would still recommend that you keep in your back pocket, reserve the right to come back afterwards and say, obviously we had to act quickly in the situation, but in the future, how could we avoid having to make kind of hip pocket discussions where we have to just jump out there, because we took a lot of risk in making that decision the way we did, and it worked out this time, or it didn't work out as well as we would have liked this time. But how can we be more proactive about this and more planful next time? So even in an emergency, I would say you want to go back and talk that through a little bit with your client, if that makes sense. Great questions. Thank you. All right. So you can thank him because he delayed the inevitable, me putting you to work for a little bit longer. But of course, that's where we're going next. So, I'm going to ask you to get into pairs, not three people this time, but if everybody could pair up, find someone that you're willing to sit down and talk with, because we're going to go through this a couple of times. And here's what we're going to do the first time. And you know me well enough already, I think, to know that this won't be the last role play that you'll be doing and the last chance that you'll get a chance to take it from the head to the gut. So the first thing you're going to do in your pair is decide who's going to be what I call the problem person. And think about a real problem in your life. I don't care if it's professional or if it's personal, as long as you're willing to share it with someone. And I'm going to ask that person to describe the problem in enough detail so the other person gets it. And then when we start the role play, you're not going to do that yet. I'll tell you when we're going to get going. You're going to ask for help. And you're going to ask that person knowing that whatever your problem is, your view of them is they are an expert in that. So I don't care if you have a really weird corn on your foot. The person you're talking to is like the world's foremost expert on foot health. The person who's on the other side of this pairing, you're going to think of yourself as the person with the right answer. In fact, I'm going to give you a very strange instruction. Even if you don't know what the answer is, you're going to decide what that answer is. You're just going to reach into your intuition, you're going to pluck it out of thin air if you have to, and you're going to show up as the expert. This is a bad application, by the way, of what we heard earlier today about, fake it until you can make it. This time, you're purely perhaps going to be faking it this time, and that's all right. And we're going to ask you to tell them that right answer. I'm only going to give you about 90 seconds for this once you get settled on who's doing what role, but I want the expert to show up as 100% expert. You have conviction that what you're sharing is absolute gold with the person you're partnered with. Does anybody not have a partner? I see one person sitting by themselves, so I want to make sure everybody has a partner. Does everybody have a partner? Anybody need a partner? You'll sit with her? Great, thank you very much. All right, so once you've paired up, again, what I'm going to ask you to do is one of you is going to be the quote-unquote problem person. The other person is going to be the expert. If you think it's fun to be the problem person this round, you should probably know that something's coming in the second round, so make your choices accordingly. Once you've identified what the problem is, then you can begin. I'm going to put 90 seconds on the clock. Whenever you're ready, go. $20 more seconds of expertise. Five, four, three, two, one. All right, time is up. Here's what I'd like to do. I have a mic in my hand that I can hand to anybody that I can't hear very well since my ear is still blocked up, believe it or not, on day 2. But I'm going to start first with the experts. Can I just see the hands of who is playing the expert in this particular situation? All right, so we have lots of experts in the room, and I can't wait to hear some of the topics that you had to be expert on. I would ask that if you're sharing something that's somewhat personal or sensitive, use your judgment on how much detail you give on whatever it is. But I'd like to hear from the expert. You were sucked into being an expert, only for 90 seconds, but still, you didn't sign up for that necessarily. What was it like? What word would you use to describe, or how would you help us understand what it felt like to be the expert? Who can get us started? Okay, repeat, yes. What did it feel like to be the expert? Empowered, I heard empowered over here. What else, how else would you describe what it was like to be the expert?
It made me feel like I'm the 100% resourceful person that has the right answers and is able to instill confidence in the person who is looking towards me for the solution to that problem.
Ah, so you fully stepped into that role as expert.
Incidentally, the solution I gave, my partner here was very happy with it and thought I was indeed 100%.
So not only did you act as an expert, you got confirmation that you were an expert. All right, how about anybody else? What else was it like to be an expert? Any other words come to mind?
I asked my partner, and I was hoping that I would be the problem person. Because
You'll get your chance.
Because I fell right into the pit. That's what I do all the time. I'm being asked, and I jump right in with an answer. So I was comfortable falling for the 60-second expert. So
Great.
that's the problem.
Ah. So oftentimes we fall into the trap of being the expert because if someone says, I'm having this problem, even if they don't ask for our help, a human tendency oftentimes is to suggest a solution, because otherwise why would they be telling you, right? But that's not always what people want. How about you?
I probably felt a little pressured because I felt the need to give a good answer that would actually solve the problem.
Something that would be solving, or at least helpful, at least in the right direction, right? So it's interesting that when you are asked to show up as an expert, a lot of different words we heard. We heard empowered. We heard that I felt confident, and I felt like someone needed me, or I felt an obligation to be helpful. There's a lot that's very seductive when you feel you're being asked to show up as the expert. It feels good in many ways. It can also feel scary. In fact, if you're going to give up the need to immediately show up as the expert, what do you personally need to let go of? What are some of the things? I heard ego. Who said that? Over here. Great, thanks. Oh, you're both pointing at each other now. So perhaps ego, that you have to make sure that you're not considering you're the only one that has the wisdom to answer this. You might have to let go of your preconceived ideas that you know what needs to be done here, or you know that you understand the problem completely from their point of view, what would be helpful for them. Good. What else? You might have to let go of some personal biases because we all have filters, our own experience, that we're hearing this problem through the filter of our experience and what this problem means to us or how we would feel about it, and it's really hard to let go of that. Great answers, great thoughts. So I want to highlight that the pull, the gravitational pull of showing up as an expert is very strong, and it's not easily ignored. So I say that for two reasons. Number one, it's natural for us to fall into that. It's very natural for us as human beings to want to be of help, to show up as someone who knows stuff that's really valuable, that we care enough about someone else to actually share our expertise with them. There's any number of reasons or motivations that are quite positive about why we'd show up as an expert. It's not all about just necessarily, an overgrown ego. That can sometimes happen too. You have to do an ego check for sure. But there's lots of positive reasons that we can get sucked into that. It doesn't necessarily make it positive that we fall prey to that, however, and we'll talk about that as we get into it. Any other comments on the showing up as the expert piece? I want to make sure that everybody got it over here. What did you want to share?
Well, I felt like a genius hearing his problem.
So there's a little bit of reinforcement there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we pay ourselves psychological paychecks when we show up as the expert, don't we?
Definitely.
That it feels good, though, that someone wanted my opinion, and I was of help to them, and damn, I'm good. So definitely that's part of it as well. Over here?
Okay, yes. So I felt pressured because of the timeline that you set.
It's 90 seconds. That's,
Right, 90
that's a short
seconds.
time
So-
window to show up as an expert.
Right. But even while I was giving my suggestions based on my own experience, there was still a caution within me because the truth is that there are questions that needed to be asked. You needed to get at what the root of the real issue is so that what you are suggesting, so it's generic, it's broad, it can work, all things equal, but you know within yourself that there may be issues that
More to the picture, perhaps. Yeah, yeah. And going back to some of the earlier questions that were asked right up here at the front of the room, again, I only gave you 90 seconds on purpose because it's that first 60 to 90 seconds of the consulting engagement where we are most susceptible to showing up immediately. Again, I'm not saying don't show up as valuable. I'm saying say no to be of immediate value because it's really tempting, even in some of these situations, I would bet that some of the situations that you were asked to address, you had some pretty good advice for. There might have been some that were so complex or so deep or so personal or so foreign to you that you had to fake it. And I will tell you that regardless of whether you have something useful to say or relevant to say or not, when you are put on the spot in a consulting engagement, the obligation to say something is very strong. And sometimes saying something is the worst thing you can do if it's actually off target. So let's go to the next part of this. As I already foreshadowed, you will have a chance in your partnership. So for those people that wanted to be the problem person, your time has come. So here's where we're going with the second one. Again, it's a very brief exercise, but again, I'm trying to take it from the head to the gut, because talking about it helps, but when you experience it, it becomes real. So the next role play, you're going to switch roles. So if you were the problem person this time you are going to be the servant. And what is the other person going to do? They're going to be not only a problem person, they're going to be a mega problem person. Because I want you to come up with a long list of everything you need solved in your life. So earlier, Felicia asked you to come up with 10 life purposes, and then she downgraded it to 5. I'm going to ask you for at least 5 major problems that are really vexing you. 5 things that are on your mind, 5 things that you wake up too early in the morning thinking about. Whatever it is, I want you to, and this is part therapy, by the way, I want you to get those down so you can be clear about them. Once you have at least 5 things, I'm going to put 90 seconds on the clock, and the person who is the servant, I want you to take it all on you. It's all going to be on your shoulders. You're going to say, yes, I can help you with that. Yes, I'll take that on. And you're going to agree to everything that they want. That's the role I want you to play for that 90 seconds. Before I set you loose, any questions? Any questions of what I'm looking for? All right, so once that person has come up with their list of at least 5 problems, you may begin whenever you're ready. I'll put 90 seconds on the clock starting at 23:30. So you have another 10 seconds before we start the clock. I want to hear some passion. I want to hear some anguish. I want to hear some real problems in the room. All right, you may begin whenever you're ready. 90 seconds. Say, yes, I can help you with that. Don't worry, I got it. Thirty more seconds. Pile it on. 10 seconds. Okay, time is up. Again, I have a mic here. I'm really interested this time in hearing not only from the servants, but I also want to hear from the problem people, what that felt like and what that was like for them. So, first for the people who acted as servants. I can hear these problems are still going. All right, I'm going to ask you to clap your hands once if you can hear me. One more time. Thank you. Okay, I'd love to hear from some of the people who acted in the servant role. Can I just see hands up who was acting in the servant role in this role play? Hands up, please. If you acted as the servant in this situation, when you were taking it all on, can I see your hand up in the air? All right. So, who has something to add? What was it like to be in that position? Anybody tell us? So what was that like for you, ma'am?
I kind of felt relieved to know that there was someone I could take my problem to who would sit and listen and offer some advice.
Oh, you were the problem person. You weren't. Oh, we want to hear from her. We want to hear from her first.
I was a little bit pressured because she was coming to me with 5 problems, and I was thinking in my head, well, I have to try and help her with all 5. So I was a little bit pressured.
So your family's not getting fed tonight because you got to take on all her problems, right? You can't go home. You can't cook dinner tonight if that was on your agenda. Who else had their hand up that they had something they wanted to add? So you were on the receiving end of all of his problems?
Right. I felt incompetent, and then I had the same problems like he was telling me. I wanted to tell him my problems.
You want to talk about problems? I've got problems. Who else had their hand up? Over here and then back here?
So I was the person with the problem.
You were the person with the problem?
But it felt liberating to know that there was somebody that was going to help me now, and I didn't have to have all of this on my head anymore. I could get help.
Interesting. All right, so when you're unloading your problems on someone else, even if you know in your heart of hearts you still own them, I'll get back to you in just 1 minute, it still feels somewhat relieving to be able to dump it on someone else. I'm interested in how it felt to you, however.
I'm asking, like, seriously? So many problems? How am I going to solve? I mean, seriously? Me?
We had a hand up over here. Were you on the receiving end of the problems?
Yes, I was on the receiving end.
Okay.
Because he was saying all of these problems to me, I figure I am now having some problems, right? Because I'm wondering how I'm going to...
So you felt better about yourself?
Yes, I feel... How am I going to assist him with all of these problems? I mean, they're... I don't know how I'm going to assist him.
You might have to spend some time after the session now. Someone over here had their hand up as well. One more. Here you go.
Oh, I was the one with the problems. It kind of felt good to just hand them to someone even for 90 seconds.
Huh? Yeah, just to be able to articulate them and have someone else at least interested. That tells you a lot about us as human beings, that if simply the act of having someone listen to us for 90 seconds feels that good, that tells you something about how complex our lives are and what's going on. I see a hand up here. Before we move on from this exercise, catch one more. Here you go.
Okay, I felt overwhelmed because the expectations were so high, and I felt like Superwoman.
So you felt both overwhelmed and challenged by this, it sounds like. Oh, interesting, interesting. So what we had in that brief demonstration is obviously that there is a lot of power, there's a lot of gravitational pull with that seemingly simple, innocent request for help. We feel like we have to either show up and get it all done and shoulder that, and we walk out of that meeting saying we have the weight of the world on our shoulders, and now we own it. Like, what kind of magic is that in 90 seconds they could transfer all that from them to you? And yet, as human beings, we have that capacity to do that without even making that choice, that it just seems to happen. Again, it's like we stepped into the puddle, and it's wet. It was wet before we got there, but we didn't realize we were stepping into a puddle until our feet were soaking wet. So the first and most important thing about this whole issue is making sure that you see that for what it is. And not that there aren't some times when you should show up immediately as a servant or as an expert, like in the emergency situation you gave earlier, but often, the majority of the times, it's probably not the best approach for you, the client, or the organization. So, where do we go from there? How do we get from this land of the expert and the servant to this land of effective consulting? And it's not so easy as just taking a walk. There's a huge chasm between what we would typically do, what's our easy, no-thinking, reflex action, and actually a much more strategic, thoughtful, willpower-based approach to how we consult with our clients. Because you can sit there and look at the edge, but you can also say, how am I going to get over there? What's it going to take? We've already talked a little bit about what you need to let go of. You might need to let go of ego. You might need to let go of the need to be helpful above all else. You might need to let go, certainly, of having an immediate answer. But as you peer over the edge, you might think, oh, look down there at the bottom of that chasm. There's a whole bunch of dead bodies down there. Other people who said no to clients. I don't want to necessarily know myself out of a job or out of a contract with this client, whether it's internal or external. I fear, or I have a legitimate concern about I don't want to end up down there. So what am I going to do about that? One of the things that we find very interesting, actually, is that when you really think about it, the key difference is that those bodies in the bottom of the chasm are actually people who didn't resist saying no to being of immediate value. That is the sure path to having broken client relationships, unsuccessful projects, organizational transformations that don't transform, et cetera, et cetera. That actually the bigger risk by far is saying yes too early. Does that make sense? So although we might fear jumping over that chasm and we see all those broken bodies down below us, it's not necessarily because people stopped and said, I certainly have an answer for you and I am fully committed to delivering a solution, but before we come up with the answer, I think there's some things that we need to address first. And again, I'm not talking about you need to delay anything by a month or a week or even necessarily a whole day, but you do have to resist that strong temptation to have an immediate answer. Did you have a question?
I was just wondering, is it a matter of proving your worth when you jump in to make an immediate, to do an immediate, have an immediate action?
I think, well, that's one of the reasons that I asked the question I did before. Thanks for bringing that up again, because it's timely to think and re-examine that now. What does lead us as human beings to do this? There's many answers. It might be the ego. It might be the need to be of help. It might be, this is what I'm hired to do. I have to fulfill my role to be the expert. It could be any number of things. But being aware of that pull, of that tractor beam that's going to suck you into the Death Star, is very important to make sure that you do understand what is prodding you. Sometimes it's as basic as the human need to solve a problem. And that's a very, very compelling force in our brains. Brains do not like questions without answers, and we want to fill that void as soon as possible. I want to give you an example. If you sent a message to someone who's a good friend of yours, and they didn't respond one time, would you think much of it? Probably not. But if you sent them 3 messages, 3 texts, or however you communicated, do you fill in that blank with a good story? Yeah. It's very easy to fill in with, are they mad at me? Did I do something? Are they okay? There's any number of things that our brain can manufacture. How long does it take for us to make up those stories? Does it take a day or an hour? Yeah, nanoseconds. Our brains can fill in that blank immediately. And that's exactly what we're trying to work against, is that natural inclination to fill that gap, because we as human beings are often uncomfortable with that. So, great question to reinforce that. So, what is it going to take? Well, you basically have to realize that actually the path to better success for you, your client, the organization, is to make that leap and actually say no to being of immediate value and landing in that land of effective consulting, but how do we do that? Well, the answer to that is that there are some simple steps. And again, I'm not going to give you the 10 steps of consulting. I'm going to specifically focus on this dynamic that we're exploring together today. And some of the answers have already been teased out of me early, as we'll get to. So you'll see how prescient you were in some of your thoughts. So the first thing to do is, step one, you've got to say no. And what form that saying no takes can be very different depending on your style, the situation, the client, your relationship with them, et cetera, et cetera. I want to come back later and have you have a chance to discuss the various ways you might see no, but I want you to do that with the context of the other steps in mind. The second step is to clarify roles and responsibilities. This is a little different than asking questions, but it's certainly related. And we'll get to the questions in a minute. But by clarifying roles and responsibilities, what you need to do up front is contract with your client to say, let's get clear on what I'll do. Let's get clear on what you'll do. Let's get clear on what I can't do and what I can do. And let's also open it up to, as unforeseen things happen, how we're going to handle those. In fact, let's guess at what some of those curveballs might be now and decide in advance how we're likely to handle those, because that'll speed things up. But if something really unexpected comes up, we might need to come back and re-clarify and have another discussion around clarifying roles and responsibilities. So I just want to do a reality check. Does that make sense to people? Yes, thank you. All right, then we get to, and you were right on the money here, ask smart questions. Now, what do I mean by smart questions? I'm not necessarily referring to the SMART objectives that we talked about earlier in this session, where you have specific, measurable, attainable, et cetera. But smart questions are the ones that elicit information. You don't want to ask questions that are really just confirming what you already know. Because a question like, so do you think we need to do leadership training, is not really a question. You really need to ask questions that are going to open up the discussion and get additional data. And maybe even make it okay for that client to say the magic words, I don't know, but we should find out. So asking smart questions are usually open-ended and then you narrow in afterwards, but making sure that your intent is clean. And by that I mean you're clearly looking to gather information, not just confirm your wisdom or the beauty of your ideas that you already have cooked up in your head. Because that's asking questions that are actually statements in question clothing. You don't want to necessarily lead the witness, to use a lawyer term, as we said. And then you can get to productivity. So again, I said it's not 10 steps. You don't necessarily need to do 10 things to do this. You might ask lots of questions. You might actually need to go do some additional interviews, a needs assessment, a survey, talk to additional stakeholders, something like that. It depends on the situation. So it's not like you're going to have a 3-minute discussion with your client and then, all right, we'll be done with that. But these are the types of behaviors that you can get at. And at the end of this presentation, I'll even refer you to a couple of books that I've found very helpful in my career as a consultant that really have great, and there's no shortage of great information out there on how to do these things effectively. But at a high level, this is what we're talking about. So with that said, I would like to do one final role play, but I'm not going to, and here's why. Because we have 8 minutes left, and I want to open it up to more questions. What I do want to do is go through a couple more slides very quickly, and I'm going to ask you to do something very strange right now. I'm going to ask you to make room with your shirt or your blouse and grab between your thumb and your forefinger a piece of skin on your arm. And squeeze it just hard enough that it gets your attention. We call that, thank you for doing that, we call that the pinch. Because the pinch is something that I want you to also look out for. The pinch is when you're in the middle of a project and you've done all these things well, and still things come up, delays happen. Suddenly your sponsor's not available. Suddenly budget becomes an issue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When inevitable complications arise, you have to feel that pinch and know what to do about it. Because if you don't, even if you did a good job in the initial consultation, you're going to end up in that same disempowering place. So what can happen is if you manage the pinch well, if you recognize that pinch for what it is, and you'll know it when you feel it, when you start to feel overwhelmed, when you start to feel anxiety, when you're feeling like, I don't know what to do next, or how am I going to get this done, or this feels hopeless to me, those are examples of what it feels like to have that pinch. And when that happens, you need to go back to re-clarify roles and responsibilities. Does that make sense? So you need to do that to make sure that you don't let it go too far and go down the wrong path. Because if you don't, not only will you start to feel anxiety, if you let it go too long, and sorry for these really outdated cartoon faces, then you really start to get burdened and you start to feel hopeless, and eventually it's going to lead to you feeling burnt out. And that's where you actually can crash and burn on the job, or perhaps get turned off from your role, or perhaps have the client look for a different solution other than you. So we don't want that to happen. So make sure you have that safety clause in place, that when you feel that pinch, that's your signal that you should be renegotiating. So with that said, I want to point out there's some resources here, but more importantly than that, I want to turn it over for any questions that you might have. We have a mic, if I remember where I put it. If anybody wants to step up to the mic, or I can bring a mic to you, I'd like to make sure we have some time for some questions. Great. You've already asked a couple of great ones. We're expecting greatness.
Okay, the pinch is the one that really gets to me, because...
Is that familiar to you?
Very familiar, because the pinch is normally that which is out of my control.
Oftentimes it is something that we didn't create,
Yes.
but
And
we are
we're
feeling
still
responsible for it, however.
Feeling responsible
Yes.
for it, and it's deemed as if you are, because you have direct and indirect responsibilities.
Yeah.
How do we deal with that?
Great question. Thank you. So in response to the great question, I would say a couple of things. One is, this is more reinforcement than even before of why you need to do the initial contracting and why you need to avoid falling into that easy trap of being immediately an expert or a servant. Because if you've done either of those things, you haven't developed that co-learning partnership that you need when the pinch happens. If the pinch happens and you've already said, I'm the expert, I've got this, or I'm the servant, I'll do exactly what you do and I will deliver results for you, it's harder for you to go back when you feel this pinch and renegotiate and say, I need something different from you now. You can do it, but it's much more difficult. If, however, you started off by saying, we're in this together, we clarified roles and responsibilities. In fact, if you even had the foresight, and I would recommend this, to say, so if things significantly change, I want to reserve the right to make sure we have an agreement that I can come back to you and we can partner on how to make sure this project stays on course and that we deliver an outstanding result. So if you have the foresight to do that up front, when the pinch happens, A, you can catch it early, and B, you've already established a partner so you're not dealing with this burden alone. That's really key, so thank you for bringing that up. Another great question. I swear I didn't pay him, but I should have. What other questions might you have? I didn't go to the gym this morning, so this is my exercise. This is awesome.
Morning. I'm
Mark
Mark
King.
King from Jamaica Barrellas. Throughout the discussion, there is a level or component of vulnerability that experts have to deal with on a daily basis or within specific projects. The question is, how should experts value that? Even as middle managers going
How should experts what?
Value or place that level of vulnerability in approaching problems.
And I'm sorry, vulnerability that they're feeling, or
Right,
vulnerability
correct.
that their client is feeling?
They're feeling, because you have situations that you may not know the answer for.
Yes.
So how should that be placed? How should that be valued?
Yeah. Great question. So how do you address it is what you're really getting at there? So I have an opinion on this, but I would also invite others, because I'm sure many of you have been in this situation. So you're asked to come in and help, and maybe you are the expert, or maybe you've been sold as the expert, and even if you are the expert, there's always going to be a situation where, gee, I haven't seen that before, this is unusual, or I'm not exactly sure what to do with this situation. So you're feeling that vulnerability of, I've been sold as the expert, or I've even sold myself as the expert, and now I'm unsure on my ability to deliver at that level. What do I do about that? I would say that you have a couple of obvious choices. One is you can fake it and say, here's what we're going to do, and say that with absolute conviction and so much confidence that the client buys it. And then go do some homework and make sure that was the right solution. I don't actually recommend that, but I know people who are able to do that if you have the confidence and you have the support network behind you to get the expertise, the resources, and the knowledge that you lack to come up with that solution and actually truly be the expert. That's easier to do when you have an army of a large consulting firm behind you. If you don't have that, I would say it takes a lot of egolessness to do this, but I would say I have to be honest with you. I've experienced many of these situations before. Yours is a little unique, and I need to do some thinking, I need to do some digging, and I need to discuss this with you because, again, we're in this together, and I want to make sure that we're really taking into account the full complexity of this situation. I find when I do that, or some version of that, I'm not saying you should repeat that phrase, but when I do some version of that, I get more respect from my clients, not less. Does that feel real to you? Great. Any other questions? We have 1 minute left. Anybody have a bad joke they would be willing to share? No more? All right, well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed spending my afternoon with you, or my morning with you and my afternoon yesterday. Thank you.